This had been the sound and image of commuter railroading in northern New Jersey for nearly a quarter of a century. In the summer of 1994, the big General Electric U34CH diesel locomotives pulled and pushed their last miles in revenue service for New Jersey Transit, wrapping up a career that had links to the steam era. The U34CHs had been purchased in 1970 to displace first-generation diesels, which had replaced steam locomotives on the Erie and Lackawanna lines in northern New Jersey. Because of their original dark blue and silver colors, these impressive units were often referred to as bluebirds, and they wrote a significant chapter in the development of the American diesel locomotive. They were the first units built from the ground up as commuter locomotives that supplied electricity to the passenger cars from the same diesel engine that moved the train. It was a concept that quickly became an industry standard and was adapted by other commuter lines as well as Amtrak. How did all of this come about, and why were the U34CHs significant? It all goes back to the earliest passenger trains. Travelers in the coaches needed to be kept warm in the winter and provided with light at night. This was originally accomplished with coal stoves in each car for heat and kerosene or gas lamps for light. With steam engines pulling the train, it wasn't long before somebody figured out how to borrow steam from the engine to heat the passenger cars. Steam pipes between the cars brought heat back from the locomotive, and by the early 1900s, passengers had warm cars to ride in. Electric lights were the obvious replacements for kerosene or gas, and the big long-distance passenger cars were equipped with axle-driven generators and huge boxes of batteries. As long as the train was moving at a reasonable speed, the generators charged the batteries, and the lights stayed bright through all the station stops. But let the car move slowly or sit still for any length of time, and the world would soon begin to go dim. Commuter trains, which often sat still for 20 out of every 24 hours, were a problem for the axle, generator, and battery system. Some railroads, including the Jersey Central and Chicago and Northwestern, developed the first head-end power systems by putting oversized steam-driven turbo generators on their steam locomotives to provide electricity for lighting the passenger cars. Thus, when diesels arrived in the 1940s, most commuter equipment was heated by steam and lighted with electricity supplied by the locomotive. Since a diesel locomotive is an electrically powered machine, providing electricity for train lighting was an easy and obvious task. Coming up with steam to heat the coaches was another matter entirely. As a result of this need, early passenger diesels, both road haul and commuter, were equipped with small boilers to create and supply steam for train heating. Fired on diesel fuel and controlled by electricity, these steam generators were temperamental and required a lot of maintenance. They were in universal use from the 1930s until the 1980s. Even the most modern passenger diesels built in the 1960s were pretending to be steam locomotives. This is where the Erie and Lackawanna railroads were on October 17, 1960, when the merger creating the new Erie-Lackawanna Railroad took effect. A fleet of 192 old Erie Stillwell cars and Lackawanna Boonton cars, which had been built in the teens and 20s to run behind steam, was being pulled by a collection of Alco road switchers and an assortment of Electromotive V8s and GP7s. All of these diesels had steam generators to supply train heating. Air conditioning consisted of open windows. Other than the type of motive power and the name on the equipment, nothing much had really changed on the Erie and Lackawanna lines in more than 50 years. Meanwhile, in the Midwest, the image of commuter trains was changing as Chicago discovered the bi-level gallery cars, which could hold many more passengers in a shorter length train, an important consideration in cramped terminals and at short station platforms. These cars were lighted, heated, and air-conditioned by electricity. The bi-level commuter cars, introduced in the early 1950s on the Chicago and Northwestern Railway, each had diesel-driven power units slung under their floors to supply electricity, allowing them to be used in any consist with any type of motive power. But this flexibility came at a high price, as the Northwestern bi-levels were expensive to build and difficult to maintain. A short while later, the neighboring Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy took a different approach by placing a separate power car containing a diesel-driven electrical generator at one end of the train. As on the Northwestern, the locomotive, either steam or diesel, supplied only the pulling power, but not heat or light. Then came the push-pull concept, where the locomotive pulled the train in one direction and pushed it in the other. A cab car was placed at the rear of the train, allowing the engineer to control the locomotive when it was in the push mode. The train, or locomotive, no longer had to be turned at the end of each trip, saving time and switching moves. Diesels assigned to push-pull service were equipped with auxiliary generators to supply electricity to the train, eliminating the need for generator cars. Interestingly, many road diesels were converted to this head-end power system, called HEP or HEP, by replacing the steam generator with a diesel generator package. In 1967, the Commuter Operating Agency of the New Jersey Department of Transportation, usually referred to as NJDOT or DOT, assumed responsibility for the commuter services offered by both the Erie-Lackawanna and the Jersey Central Railroads. On the Jersey Central, NJDOT inherited a decrepit collection of first-generation diesels, which was in immediate need of replacement. To save the CNJ commuter system from total collapse, an order was quickly placed with the Electromotive Division of General Motors. And in 1968, the Jersey Central received 13 brand new GP40P diesels. The new units were still linked to the steam era because they were equipped with steam generators and extra electrical generators to supply heat and light to the existing fleet of vintage commuter cars and some second-hand mainline coaches. Having solved the Jersey Central's motive power problem, in 1970, the New Jersey Department of Transportation next turned its attention to upgrading equipment on the Erie-Lackawanna commuter lines. After carefully assessing the situation, DOT management decided on an ambitious $80 million modernization program, which would involve the purchase of new rolling stock. For the first time, these new locomotives and cars would be designed from the outset to work together. Because of overhead clearance restrictions, Midwestern-style bi-level gallery cars could not be used, but the new single-level Erie-Lackawanna equipment would be push-pull and set up for head-end power. There would be no more steam heat. To bring the Erie-Lackawanna into the modern era, the DOT ordered 105 new brushed aluminum push-pull cars from Pullman Standard of Chicago. The fleet included 71 coaches, 24 cab control cars, and 10 bar cars. To pull these sleek air-conditioned coaches, 32 U34CH diesel locomotives were erected by General Electric at their Erie, Pennsylvania plant. the first modern GE diesels built expressly for passenger service, and the first with head-end power equipment instead of steam generators. The U34CHs were actually modified GE U36C 3600 horsepower freight units, although their construction predated the first U36Cs by more than a year. Like the U36Cs, the new passenger engines were 67 feet long, weighed 394,000 pounds, and had a fuel capacity of 4,000 gallons. The U34CHs were assigned road numbers 3351 through 3382 as part of the Erie-Lackawanna's six-axle GE numbering series. Because of their attractive dark blue, silver, and red paint scheme, the locomotives were soon dubbed Bluebirds by railroad personnel. Red EL diamond logos adorn the front and back of each engine, while round NJ dot emblems were placed on the sides of the car body. The road number appeared in red underneath the cab windows. This photograph shows the first two units at the Erie plant on October 23, 1970. The inspector's tag is still in place over the cab window. The third unit, number 3353, was photographed by Rail Pace editor Tom Nemeth on the turntable at Croxton Engine Terminal. Tom also caught four brand new U34CHs, led by 3352, at Croxton on December 7, 1970. The new head-end power-equipped diesels were never used with the old passenger cars, so these locomotives had to wait for the arrival of the new coaches in early 1971 before they could enter service as complete train sets. Meanwhile, GE continued to outshop the new diesels at their Erie plant. Here's brand new 3361, photographed on March 27, 1971. Numbers 3370 and 3368 were awaiting delivery 3 weeks later. Delivery of the U34CHs continued until January 1973, when the 32nd and last unit, number 3382, was completed. Head-end power was produced by an alternator permanently coupled to the main drive shaft of the diesel engine, instead of being developed by an auxiliary diesel generator set. To keep the head-end power alternator producing its proper electrical output, the diesel engine turned at a constant speed of 960 RPM, the equivalent of full throttle in the traditional Run 8. On the U34CH, this is known as the passenger run position. Under full load, the HEP alternator subtracted about 170 horsepower from the diesel engine, leaving 3,430 horses for traction to pull the train. Thus, the model designation U34CH, or Universal 3,400 horsepower, C for CC, or 6-motor configuration, and H for head-end power. When a U34CH was stopped or working at a lower throttle position, the traction alternator would be excited to the necessary degree, and fuel would be simultaneously fed to the diesel engine to keep the RPM constant in spite of the varying load. This gave the U34CHs their distinctive high rev sound when idling at a station stop, and the unusual flat sound when accelerating, because the engine was being worked much harder, but the rotation speed would not change. When a train set was in the yard awaiting its next assignment, the U34 was placed in the passenger standby mode. With the engine now turning at 650 RPM, the main traction alternator could provide enough power for the train's climate control and lighting systems, but not for the operation of the locomotive itself. If head-end power was not needed, the engineer could select the freight run position. In this mode, The U-34 would now idle at 275 RPM and operate like any other freight unit. When General Electric introduced its Universal Series diesels with the U-25B back in 1959, locomotive enthusiasts quickly dubbed them U-boats. The U-34CHs were no exception, and rail fans called the new passenger units U-boats as often as they were called Bluebirds. On the other hand, Erie-Lackawanna personnel rarely referred to the U-34CHs as U-boats, preferring to call them Bluebirds, or most often 3300s, as denoted by their number series. Upon entering service in 1971, the new train sets were assigned to the former Erie and Lackawanna diesel-hauled routes originating in Hoboken Terminal. From east to west, the former Erie lines include the New Jersey and New York Railroad, known today as the Pascack Valley Line, which branches off the main line at Pascack Junction near Rutherford and extends to Spring Valley, New York, 30.3 rail miles from Hoboken Terminal. The Bergen County Line, which diverges northeastward from the main line at Bergen Junction in the Meadowlands, travels through Rutherford, Fairlawn, and Glen Rock, and rejoins the main line at Ridgewood Junction, and the main line itself, which extends to Suffern and Port Jervis, New York via Passaic and Patterson. Port Jervis, 87 miles northwest of Hoboken, was the most distant point served by Erie-Lackawanna commuter trains. On the Lackawanna side, the new train sets primarily served the Boonton line between Hoboken and Denville via Montclair, Tawaco, and Boonton. From Denville, diesel-haul trains continued westward to Dover, Port Morris, and Netcong, 48 miles from Hoboken. The Bluebirds also worked under the wires on the electrified lines of the former Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad. These juice lines include the Morrison-Essex, or M&E Main Line between Hoboken and Dover via Newark and Morristown, known as the Morristown Line. The Rambling Gladstone, or Passaic and Delaware branch, known to railroaders as the P&D, which leaves the M&E Main Line just west of Summit, and the short Montclair branch extending from Roseville Avenue in Newark to Montclair. When they were first introduced, the new equipment occasionally substituted for the ancient multiple-unit electric trains dating from the early 1930s. Later on, a number of Bluebird-hauled trains were permanently added to the schedule. With a gear ratio of 81 to 22, the new U-34CHs could easily run at 85 miles an hour. Because these engines were not equipped with cab signals, Federal Railroad Administration regulations restricted their top speed to 79 miles an hour. An overspeed regulator automatically applied the brakes when the engine exceeded that speed. All 32 Bluebirds remained in their original paint scheme until 1974, when engine 3351, the first U-34CH, was involved in a collision on the Boonton line. After a 2-year overhaul at the General Electric plant in Cleveland, Ohio, during which the cab and other equipment was replaced, engine 3351 was sent to the EL's Hornell shops for repainting. The rebuilt U-boat rolled out of the shop with a flamboyant red, white, and blue bicentennial paint scheme and a new number. The 3351 became engine 1776 to help celebrate the 200th birthday of the United States of America. Meanwhile, on April 1, 1976, the Erie-Lackawanna became part of the government-sponsored freight railroad known as Conrail, which resulted in the renumbering of the entire EL locomotive fleet. As the Bluebirds were owned by the New Jersey Department of Transportation and were not included in the Conrail takeover, they retained their 3300 series numbers, even though a group of Conrail GP40s carried duplicate road numbers. In 1978, however, the U-34s were assigned road numbers 4151 to 4182. The EL Diamond logos were removed at that time, and at least one unit, number 4156, had an NJDOT logo affixed to its nose. Meanwhile, engine 1776, which was nearing the end of its bicentennial stint, was renumbered back to 3351. In March 1978, the locomotive received its new number, 4151, when it was repainted in traditional bluebird colors at Conrail's former Jersey Central Elizabethport shops. Because shop personnel mistakenly used the old Erie-Lackawanna freight diesel paint diagrams instead of the correct bluebird charts, the location and width of the silver stripe and the oversized cab numerals did not match the rest of the U-34 fleet. The result was another unique U-boat paint scheme, which the 4151 carried until its retirement. By 1977, the 32 U-boats were covering 120 scheduled passenger trains originating in Hoboken Terminal. These included 80 runs on the Maine and Bergen County lines, 25 on the Boonton line, 12 on the Pascack Valley route, and 3 on the Morristown line. A 33rd Bluebird joined the fleet in October 1978 when GE converted Chicago and Northwestern U30C number 934 into a U34CH. Numbered 4183, it was purchased by the Metropolitan Transportation Authority of New York, which subsidizes Hoboken-based commuter rail service into New York State. The 4183 carried a plain two-tone blue MTA M logo on its nose, which was later replaced by a white M inside a navy blue circle. No further paint scheme changes occurred until 1983, when New Jersey Transit, the successor to the New Jersey Department of Transportation, assumed control of commuter rail operations in New Jersey. The former Erie-Lackawanna commuter lines became New Jersey Transit's Hoboken division. Following the takeover, 8 U-boats were repainted into NJ Transit's standard disco paint scheme, featuring a platinum mist car body with 3 slanted stripes of orange, purple, and navy blue. Because of variations in the slant and location of the stripes and the style of the numbers on the cab sides, each silver engine was unique. The NJ dot logos were also removed from the entire U-boat fleet at this time, and the silver ones got large black NJ logos on their noses. The final U-boat paint scheme modifications occurred in 1986, when the noses of the unrepainted Bluebirds were painted platinum mist and the NJ logo was applied. Our tour of U-boat territory begins at Hoboken Terminal, home base for the U-34s and all Hoboken Division commuter trains. With its classic 14-track train shed designed by Lincoln Bush, the terminal is now a registered historic landmark. In the summer of 1984, a major upgrade program was in full swing as New Jersey Transit was preparing to replace the 53-year-old Lackawanna multiple unit cars with new Aero 3 electric trains. This project was a continuation of the service improvements on the former Lackawanna Railroad, which had begun almost 60 years earlier. In 1926, rush hour rail congestion on the Lackawanna steam-hauled Morrison-Essex division had become so heavy that additional traffic In 1957, the Erie Railroad virtually closed its Pavonia Street station in Jersey City and moved most of its commuter trains into Hoboken Terminal. Shortly after the move to Hoboken, Erie Alcos and Jeeps pulling steam-heated Stillwell coaches combined with their Lackawanna counterparts to create a total of 441 train movements into and out of the terminal every weekday. Only Penn Station and Grand Central Terminal in New York City handled more daily trains. By 1959, the number of train movements began to decline as certain off-peak and weekend trains were eliminated. But Hoboken Terminal was still a very busy place on October 17, 1960, the day the Erie-Lackawanna Railroad was born. Commuter operations on the EL remained pretty much unchanged until early 1971, when the new U34CH locomotives and their electrically heated train sets began to replace the old steam-heated equipment. By the summer of 1984, another chapter in the history of the former Lackawanna Railroad was rapidly coming to a close as the new Arrow trains were about to replace their ancient MU ancestors. Before the new MUs could take over, though, the old 3,000-volt DC overhead catenary and power supply systems had to be converted to 25,000 volts AC. To make matters worse, the Wicker liners were experiencing frequent mechanical difficulties and were restricted to rush hour use only. As a result, most of the off-peak runs assigned to the elderly electrics were being handled by diesel haul trains. The 33 U-boats could not completely cover this expanded schedule, so in 1983, 6 Chicago and Northwestern F units were acquired by transit to help out. On any given day, a new F40PH-2 or one of the ex-Jersey Central GP40s or GP7s could also show up at the terminal, even though these diesels were normally assigned to the Newark division. For added variety, 2 SW9s trundled about the terminal performing miscellaneous switching chores. Diesel push-pull trains were generally assigned to tracks 2 through 8 and 15 through 17 for boarding and discharging passengers. Electric trains usually used the short track number 1 and tracks 9 through 14. At the peak of the rush hour, there is 1 train or engine movement every minute, including light engine moves. Since Hoboken Terminal is a stub-end station, diesel locomotives were always coupled to the west end of the train sets to facilitate engine changes. There was one interesting exception to this rule, however. To help clear snow and other debris from the track on the first daily inbound Pascack Valley run, a U-34 was placed on the east end of the consist. Since each train set usually covered several schedules each day, the east-facing engine could appear on other trains when it was not running on the Pascack Valley line. Double-heading sometimes occurred when a U-34 had a traction motor or main generator problem. Another diesel would provide motive power for the train, while the U-boat furnished head-end power for heating and lighting. Passengers buy their tickets in the ornate waiting room, which has recently been restored to its former grandeur. A wide concourse outside the waiting room provides access to the 17 tracks used by commuter trains and to the path trains and ferries which also serve the terminal. Upon departure from the terminal, outbound trains pass through a maze of turnouts and slip switches, entering the 4-track main line at East End interlocking. After passing over Conrail's River Line, trains reach the Bergen tunnels. These twin, mile-long, double-track bores pass under Bergen Hill, connecting the Tidewater area of Hoboken to the Jersey Meadowlands. After traveling under Bergen Hill, trains emerge from the tunnel and enter West End interlocking, where they continue west along the electrified Morristown line, or turn to the north to reach the Main and Bergen County lines and the Boonton and Pascack Valley routes. We'll tour the juice lines now and return to the terminal later on for a look at the non-electrified routes. The two massive steel bridges carry the main line over Conrail's Marion connection, which was formerly the Erie's line to Jersey City Terminal. The computer-assisted turnouts, crossovers, and signals are currently controlled by Terminal Tower. In 1984, when these scenes were taken, the interlocking was still controlled by an operator in West End Tower. Traffic at West End is so heavy that trains frequently pause here while their routes are aligned. Approaching the Meadows, trains pass under New Jersey Route 7. The Meadowlands Maintenance Center is located nearby. Kearney Junction, in the heart of the Meadows, offers some of the most intense railroad activity in the northeastern United States. Amtrak's Northeast Corridor, formerly the main line of the Pennsylvania Railroad, crosses Transit's ex-Lackawanna-Morristown line on a flyover, while Path Rapid Transit trains run parallel along the banks of the Passaic River. Conrail's Meadows Yard can be seen beyond the massive twin highway bridges of the New Jersey Turnpike. After speeding across the Meadows, westbound trains pass through Harrison, cross the Passaic River on Newark Draw, and enter Pennsylvania Station in Newark. Leaving Newark, trains ascend a grade and enter a concrete canyon, which resulted from a massive grade separation project carried out by the Lackawanna Railroad at the turn of the century. The Montclair branch begins at Roseville Avenue in Newark. Commuter trains no longer stop here. Mountain Station in South Orange is located in the middle of a long straightaway. The main line narrows to 2 tracks at Millburn, 3.5 miles to the west. Summit Station is located in a cut constructed during the Lackawanna's grade separation project. At milepost 20.11, it is just about halfway between Hoboken and Dover. P&D Junction is located 4/5 of a mile west of Summit Station. Here, trains bound for Gladstone enter the single-track Passaic and Delaware branch, better known as the Gladstone Line, for a 22-mile run to Gladstone. Our tour of the Morristown line continues at Madison, where 4169 smokes it up as it leaves the station. Almost makes you feel like yelling, Alco! The electrified Morristown line and non-electrified Boonton line join at Denville, 4 miles east of Dover. The catenary ends at Dover, where a holding yard east of the station is used to store commuter trains overnight in anticipation of the morning rush. In 1984, commuter service continued 10 miles west to Netcong. 10 years later, 1994, service was extended another 9 miles to Hackettstown. By the early 1990s, the U34CHs were entering their third decade of service. Having run millions of miles in commuter service, the big six-axle GEs were experiencing mechanical problems, which resulted in higher operating and repair expenses. Several units had already been retired, the first to go being engine 4170, which had suffered extensive fire damage in 1988. The U-34s were also the only non-General Motors power left on New Jersey Transit's roster. As a result, in the late 1980s, Transit Management mapped out a locomotive upgrade program which would ultimately lead to the retirement of the aging U-boats. All of these locomotives were built using parts from GP40s of various heritage. The first new motive power to arrive was a group of 15 remanufactured GP40 FH-2s, numbered 4130 to 4144. Built by Morris and Knudsen at their facility in Boise, Idaho, the locomotives were delivered between 1987 and 1989. These units are distinguished by their full-body cowls taken from retired Burlington Northern F-45s. The next batch of new engines to join the roster included 6 more rebuilt GP40 FH-2s ordered by the Metropolitan Transit Authority to help cover expanded service on the main lines west of Suffern. Numbered from 4184 to 4189, they began to emerge from the Boise plant in 1988, with deliveries continuing through 1990. Electric locomotives in the form of 22 new ALP 44s also contributed to the demise of the U-boats. These powerful motors, which are very similar to the AEM-7s currently in service on Amtrak's Northeast Corridor, were built by the Swedish firm of ACEA Brown Boveri. The ALP 44s were delivered in 1990 and assigned to several trains on the Morristown line, which were previously in charge of the U34s. The locomotive upgrade program continued unabated in 1991, as the 13 ex-Jersey Central GP40Ps were sent to Conrail's Juniata shops for refurbishing and conversion into GP40PH-2s. The PH-2s do not have full-body cowls like the FH-2s. The MTA needed one more GP40 FH-2 for its Port Jervis line. So in 1992, engine 4190 rolled out of the Juniata rebuild shops to join its 6 older sisters. Meanwhile, Morrison Knudsen was busy turning out another batch of 6 rebuilt GP40 PH-2s. Engines 4145 through 4150 joined the roster in 1993. To complete the upgrade program, New Jersey Transit ordered 19 remanufactured GP40 PH-2Bs from the Juniata shops. Assigned road numbers 4200 through 4218, the new units began to arrive in 1993. Deliveries continued until October 1994. As the new diesels joined the roster, the U-34s were gradually withdrawn from service. The locomotives in the worst mechanical shape were sent to the Meadowlands Maintenance Center in Kearney, universally known as the MMC, where they were parked on deadlines for disposition. Whenever a U-boat broke down on the road, it was sent to the MMC for inspection. If anything more than a simple repair was required to make it serviceable, the locomotive joined the ranks of the doomed. By October 1993, 24 U-34s remained in service, 2 of which were assigned to work train duties. 4 months later, in February 1994, the active fleet had been reduced to 13 units. Our coverage of the final months of U-boat operations begins just after the great blizzard of February 11, 1994, which dumped more than 2 feet of snow on northern New Jersey. These rush hour scenes were videotaped in dusk or after dark on the main line between Ridgewood and Ho-Ho-Kus. The famous 4-track ex-Erie main line had been reduced to 3 tracks during the mid-1980s. 10 years earlier, the U-boats filled in for the ailing Lackawanna Wicker liners when those classic MUs were beset by mechanical problems. Like the ancient electrics before them, the U-34s were now experiencing frequent mechanical mishaps of their own, and they too were generally confined to rush hour operation until newer power took over. A number of trains handled by the U-boats were 1200 series runs which terminate at Waldwick. After changing ends, the trains head back to Hoboken. These short turnarounds provided most of the eastbound action. By May 1994, only 9 U-boats were left, including the 2 in work train service. Throughout the spring and summer of 1994, Mark I crews tirelessly documented the final days of these great locomotives. Our tour of the main line begins in Hoboken Terminal on June the 9th, 1994, as Train 51 awaits the highball for its 9:35 departure to Port Jervis. In cooperation with New Jersey Transit, producer Mark Balkin was permitted to ride the cabs of engines 4172 and 4176 on several occasions to more fully document the operation of these unique locomotives. For this program, cab scenes were combined with ground sequences to provide an overview of the Bergen County line between Hoboken and Suffern.
Side of Brookside. Yeah.
After leaving the train shed, Train 51 threads its way through the turnouts and slip switches in the throat of the terminal. The exhaust of the big U-boat begins to resonate as it accelerates toward East End interlocking and the Bergen tunnels. At West End, Train 51 is routed onto the main line. It then proceeds a mile west to Bergen Junction, where it is switched onto the Bergen County line. The highlight of the fast run across the Jersey Meadowlands is crossing HX Draw across the Hackensack River, where passenger trains must slow to 30 miles per hour. Once clear of the bridge, the 4172 quickly accelerates train 51 to the 70 miles an hour maximum speed allowed for this section of the line.
Got permission back to stop signal on the clear track. And he's in the DB and proceed west to number 2 track. You out of service, over.
Roger, Roger. Former loud ME4 on 1 has permission by the stop signal at the east end of DB on the single track of the east west to the number 5.
That's the Roger, former loud. DB out.
The classic former Erie station in Rutherford, 8.4 miles west of Hoboken, is still in use today. There are a number of good photo locations in this area. One of the better spots to watch trains on the Bergen County line is just west of the station at Broadway Fairlawn. Industrial buildings on both sides of the tracks amplify the sounds of a westbound locomotive accelerating its train up the grade toward Radburn. The U-boats are shown here on several occasions in different types of light.
A little step back here. Is the whistle working? Can you hear the whistle?
Glen Rock Borough Hall is another good spot to shoot a startup. The Main and Bergen County lines rejoin at Ridgewood Junction, a half-mile east of Ridgewood Station. A steep 0.79% westbound grade begins in Ridgewood, and the U-boats really poured it on as they dug in for the climb to Hohokus. The grade continues west another 5.5 miles to Ramsey. The famous S-curve just below Waldwick Station is known among rail fans as Collins Curve in honor of legendary photographer Robert F. Collins. At Waldwick, 1200 series turnarounds pull ahead through WC interlocking, stop, change ends, and start back to Hoboken. All 1100 series New Jersey Transit trains terminate at Suffern. After unloading passengers, they pull ahead into Suffern Yard to await their next eastbound assignment. U-boat activity on the Boonton line was fairly unpredictable, so Mark I video camera crews concentrated most of their efforts elsewhere. One day in mid-June, however, an unusually high number of trains were running on the line. The action begins at the height of the rush hour on June 13, 1994, as Silver 4164 with Netcong-bound train 1051 speeds across Interstate 80 in Wayne. At Great Notch, the 4172 on westbound train 1057 roars through the station. GP40FH-2 4133 is ready to push eastbound train 1032 back toward Hoboken. Shortly after train 1032 departs, U-boat 4176 arrives at the head of train 1035, a Great Notch turn which will become eastbound 1034. Having returned to Hoboken with train 1034, engine 4176 was assigned to westbound Boonton Line train 1043, a Lincoln Park turnaround. Darkness had not yet fallen as the big U-boat pulls into Upper Montclair Station with the lights of the Bellevue Avenue Business District in the background. On the return to Hoboken, train 1042 does not stop at Upper Montclair.
Is it on? I think it is.
During the spring and summer of 1994, engines 4175 and 4166 were handling work trains on various New Jersey Transit lines. One Saturday morning in June, the pair was in charge of a ballast train on the Gladstone line. After delivering a cut of hopper cars to the Millington Quarry, the two U-boats ran light over the Millington High Bridge en route to Summit. One of the most interesting lines in U-boat territory is the Pascack Valley Line, a former Erie branch originally known as the New York and New Jersey Railroad. Since the early 1950s, 4 distinctive groups of motive power have operated over this line. Until early 1954, commuter trains were handled by the Erie's reliable K1 and K4 class Pacifics. These spotless 462s were distinguished by their unusual Vanderbilt tenders. The last steam-powered run on the New Jersey and New York, which was also the final steam run on the Erie, took place on March 17, 1954. In a familiar scenario, steam generator-equipped Alco RS-3s and EMD GP-7s were now in charge of commuter trains on the branch. Until the Erie-Lackawanna merger in 1960, this second group of locomotives sported the classic Erie black and yellow paint scheme with a winged logo on the car body ends. By the early 60s, the EL gray, maroon, yellow, and black scheme was very much in evidence on the locomotives. The venerable steam-heated Stillwells, however, still wore their drab Pullman green colors. As we have already seen, the next major change came in 1971, when the splendid new Bluebirds began to replace the first-generation diesels on the Pascack Valley Line. By the early 1990s, this third group of Pascack power was handling 7 inbound and 9 outbound weekday commuter trains between Hoboken and Woodbine Yard in Spring Valley. The U-34s began to disappear from the Pascack Valley Line when GP-40s took over the 7 outbound runs which terminate in Spring Valley. The invasion of the Jeeps was directly related to complaints by local residents that the U-34s made too much noise as they idled overnight in the yard. NJ Transit responded by restricting the U-boats to the last 2 outbound runs on the Pascack line, trains 1615 and 1617. Because Woodbine Yard can only hold 7 train sets, trains 1615 and 1617 deadhead back to Hoboken after making their last stop at Spring Valley. These non-stop inbound movements are designated trains X160 and X162, respectively. Let's return once again to Hoboken Terminal, where engine 4176 is ready to take train 1615 up the Pascack Valley Line. At precisely 8:15, the train departs for its 30-mile journey to Spring Valley. For this tour of the line, trackside scenes are combined with cab sequences shot on this train and on train 1617. The signals shine brightly as 1615 threads its way through the terminal and accelerates for a thrilling run through the tunnel. Passing through West End, the train is routed onto the Bergen County line for a quick run to Pascack Junction in Rutherford, 7.6 miles from the terminal. At the junction, 1615 is switched onto the Pascack Valley line. Freight activity on this branch is heaviest in the industrial area on the southern end of the branch. The speed limit on the branch is 40 miles per hour south of Fairmount Avenue and 50 from there to Spring Valley. At Woodbridge, the exhaust of the big U-boat booms off the concrete retaining wall for busy Route 17. Departing Essex Street in Hackensack, the train runs right up the middle of, you guessed it, Railroad Avenue. After crossing under Route 4 and over the short Colesbrook Bridge, the train pulls into North Hackensack.
North Hackensack.
This view of train 1615 crossing Musquapsing Creek in Westwood was taken at 9 p.m. on June 20th, 1994, the second longest day of the year. The ornate Hillsdale station was built in 1872 and is now listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It was recently restored to its original New Jersey and New York configuration and paint scheme. Another classic depot has been restored at Park Ridge. At Pearl River, an extended covered station platform has been built next to the original depot. Arriving at Spring Valley, the engineer proceeds to the cab car, calls for clearance, and begins the non-stop run back to Hoboken. Manhattan skyline is an impressive sight as the train approaches Hoboken Terminal.
U34s are lined up here. You got the 78, we're the 72, and the 76 is next door. There's all three of them that we're running today.
These portraits were taken during the early morning hours of June 23, 1994. Although we did not know it at the time, this was the 4178's last night, as it was placed on the deadline later that day. By the middle of August 1994, the end for the U-boat fleet was rapidly approaching. A farewell to the U-34's excursion was scheduled for August 27th, and only 3 U-boats, numbers 4172, 76, and 80, remained in regular passenger service. The only other live U-34s, engines 4166 and 75, were still assigned to work duties. The honor of pulling the last regularly scheduled U-boat-powered passenger runs was given to engine 4180. On Wednesday, August 10th, the veteran Bluebird pulled train 1615 to Spring Valley. The final outbound Pascack Valley U-boat run is shown here leaving North Hackensack. The next day, 4180 pulled the last westbound U-34 powered run to Suffern. It is shown here accelerating away from the Broadway Fairlawn station. Engine 4180 returned to Hoboken with train 1152 on Friday, August the 12th, to wrap up the U-34 era on the old Erie Main Line. At the MMC on August 15th, most of the U-boat fleet was already on the deadline. The 4176, which on first sight appeared to have expired, was being moved to the fuel track by 2 of the Jeep 40s responsible for its imminent demise. Later that day, the 4180 pulled the final regularly scheduled U-boat run to Dover. After returning to Hoboken the next morning, it was placed in standby service. On Saturday morning, August 27, 1994, engines 4172 and 4176 were in Hoboken Terminal, ready to handle the farewell to the U34CH excursion. In a surprise move, New Jersey Transit repainted both units. The excursion toured the Boonton, Morristown, Maine, and Pascack Valley lines. Photo stops were made at a number of locations. After the excursion, engine 4176 was withdrawn for preservation, while the 4172 joined sister 4166 in work train service. On Sunday morning, November 6, 1994, the unmistakable sounds of a U-34 were heard one more time as the 4172 trundled up the Pascack Valley line with 11 cars of ballast bound for Nanuet. As there are no turning facilities on the line, SW-1500 number 500 was on the other end of the train and would be in the lead on the return run. As the first class of commuter locomotives delivered with shaft-driven head-end power, the U34CHs made an important contribution to American railroading. For more than 23 years, these pioneer diesels faithfully carried thousands of commuters to work and took them home again. As a final tribute to the U-boats, then, let the fleet pass in review one last time.